Hey, welcome to Positive Takes. We're basically on the eve of Indiana Jones 5 coming out, The Dial of Destiny. So I thought it would be a good idea to go and take a look back at Indiana Jones 4 and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Now, I'm not going to say this movie was a masterpiece or anything like that, but I do think it sometimes gets unfairly maligned and it kind of gets thrown in a lot with like the prequels or something like that. When I saw this in theaters when it first came out, my first thought was that may not have been perfect, but at least it wasn't the prequels. So this came out in an era, and first of all, I think the sequel probably came out way too late, since the previous one had come out in I think '92 or '93, and this one was well into the 2000s, and obviously Harrison Ford was much older in this one than he had been previously. You can look at a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that went on and why it took so long. There's a lot of back and forth. George Lucas really wanted it to be about aliens and like the 50s serials and science fiction movies, and Steven Spielberg kind of hated that pitch and didn't want to make another alien movie. It's kind of funny because then after that he made War of the Worlds, which is definitely another alien movie. And this seems to happen a lot with their Indiana Jones thing. It's kind of their testing ground, their space to like try out something new and maybe not do what they usually do. So you can see the exact same thing happened back when they were making Last Crusade. Again, George Lucas really wanted to do like a haunted house movie, which I feel like that's what Temple of Doom is already. But anyway, Spielberg didn't want to do that because he said he just made Poltergeist and he didn't want to do that over again. So it was the exact same thing. Um, so yeah, this idea had gone through a few different drafts. I just read most of one by Frank Darabont, which is basically what this movie ended up being, but actually better in a lot of ways. I'm not really sure why they decided to keep changing things, but I guess that's just what you do in Hollywood. And anyway, so they finally settled on a script and started shooting this. This is also an era when I think the CGI stuff was going a little too overboard, where they acted like they could just use CGI to like wallpaper over every problem, instead of kind of using it as a tool, another tool set, and continuing to use practical sets and models and stuff like that. Basically, what Lord of the Rings did so perfectly that a lot of other movies of this era were kind of avoiding and ignoring. So you see this from the very first frame where it starts with this terrible CGI of, I guess they're prairie dogs. And I don't know why you couldn't just find like some actual prairie dogs to film and like have real prairie dogs in the film, but for whatever reason they're CGI. And in a way, maybe that's to prime you to like what's going to come much later in the movie and the parts that people really hate. Um, so you're basically reintroduced to Indiana Jones, and he's been kidnapped by the Russians for some reason. And another big problem this movie has right away is Ray Winstone's character. And I think Ray Winstone's actually a really good actor, but I think his character in this movie is like way too confusing and confused. I would sort of equate him to this character in The Mummy, who's like constantly double stabbing everybody and just like out for himself. But it's just not very well thought out or performed very well. Again, looking back at the Darabont script, originally it was supposed to be a Russian spy that was going to be that character, so it would have been more obvious. And I think originally it was going to be maybe Marion's godfather or something like that. I don't know, somehow related to another character that would have made it make more sense or be more satisfying. So anyway, in this script, they take them to this hidden warehouse, and this was in the original draft. This whole idea that they'd go to where the Ark of the Covenant's kept, basically, and have some action there. It seemed like originally it was intended to be like a more protracted sort of bashing trucks back and forth scene. In this case, it's like pretty quickly done with. And I should also say at the beginning of this movie, there's like sort of a reference to, I guess, American Graffiti, which is just some fun of the Russians trying to outrace Hot Rod or whatever, Archie or whatever the gang is, going to get some milkshakes or what have you. So another problem with this movie, like right away, is kind of an over-reliance on blue screens and green screens. I think you even see this when the Russians are just approaching in their trucks. Like there's just a shot of, I forget his name, but it's just the heavy in the movie who keeps like battling Jones over the course of it. And he's just like bending down to tie his shoe. And I'm pretty sure the entire backdrop is just CGI or somehow green screened in. I'm just like, why wouldn't you just shoot that in an actual location? And that's kind of the problem that a lot of movies have still now, especially all these like Marvel movies or whatever, where they're obviously like shot against green screens, shot with inserts, and they can't just like go to an actual location and shoot like real light hitting real objects. And it's very strange to me. I don't really know why that became. Well, I do know it's all about cost saving and all that, but it seems like ultimately you get a worse product out of it. Um, so they have Indy use his skills to like detect this object they're looking for. Kate Blanchett is in this movie, and she's actually really excellent. She looks very cool with her haircut. I guess her accent's fine. I'm not really an expert on accents. Probably actual Russian people hate it. I have no idea. But she has a great presence in this movie, and they also introduce very early on that she's psychic, and that characteristic doesn't really come back very often. I think it's basically in this one scene and done with, so I'm not really sure what the point is of introducing something like that. I guess it's to do the same like Nazi sort of mystique that you had in the past movies. Something like characteristic, like a scar or whatever. But in this case, it's like a psychic thing, a mind thing. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. She's just there to kind of move the plot along. I do also like this kind of a cold opening, like you don't really know what's going on, so you're kind of figuring it out alongside Indy. So eventually, he uses gunpowder to find a magnetic box, which is the remains of, an alien, basically, which ends up being this crystal skull. I think this is another big problem. I think they could have found a different MacGuffin. I don't really know who or what or why they fix on crystal skulls so much. I know that it's an actual artifact, but it's obviously just like carvings that indigenous people made. So there's absolutely no reason why that should be like this big important plot detail. This stupid crystal skull, sounds like Dan Aykroyd's vodka line, not like something that you'd have be at the center of this movie. So they retrieve the thing, and then it keeps going back and forth, I think, and then eventually Indy breaks out and he's trying to drive away. Basically it all ends up that they end up in what looks like a deserted town, and he's trying to alert the authorities. The Russians. Oh wait, no, I completely missed a part. Somehow he fights the heavy, and they break through a skylight, and they end up on this like rocket sled. This made more sense in the previous draft, where there was going to be a bunch of test rockets, and they'd have a whole rocket sequence of like people outrunning and getting hit and getting incinerated and stuff like that. But they cut all that out, probably for cost saving measures. Not that the ending looked so great, and that's probably where most of the money went for this movie. So anyway, they go in the rocket sled, and that's how Indy ends up in this like weird test site. As it turns out, it's basically that one level from Call of Duty. So it's a made up suburban city that's going to be annihilated in this nuclear blast in a minute, as they're testing a nuclear bomb just shortly off range. Another thing I find very weird about this movie is, so as we all know, the Indiana Jones movies sort of helped popularize the PG-13 rating, since Temple of Doom was rated PG and it was so violent. But then we get to this part, this era of movie making where PG-13 has been very neutered and doesn't really mean anything. So you're kind of intentionally having all this like bloodless, weightless death and destruction that doesn't really mean anything. It's just very strange because we had, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was also rated PG, and Last Crusade, which is PG-13, and all those movies kind of go for it. They're not afraid to have Indy shoot some guy or shoot some Nazis and this and that and the other thing. So it's just very strange to me that, then we get to this era of movie making, and maybe it's because Lucas was stuck in his prequel mindset, but it just seems like throughout the movie they're kind of going for like the younger demographic rather than do like truly all ages. But anyway, we have what's clearly meant to be sort of a comic scene, and this is a scene that people always complain about, and like it's become a meme, like nuking the fridge and all that. But I'm actually fine with this sequence. I never really had a problem with it, even when it came out. The one problem I do have with it is how Indy in the fridge kind of get launched like at a really high speed, and they kind of just like impact the ground, and I'm just like, okay, so even if there wasn't a nuclear blast, Indy would just be pasted inside that fridge. There's no way he would survive that, just for the force. And I think this is actually fixed in the original script because they just have it kind of riding the wave, I guess, of energy. Still not that realistic, but at least there's a reason. Like eventually, I guess the force dissipates and he just gets like settled down. rather than getting violently ejected. I think it's well known that this is basically an idea that Spielberg had all the way back from when they were making Back to the Future. Like, this was originally how that movie was supposed to end, with Marty breaking into a nuclear test site and like using I don't think it was even a car at that point, but basically using the time machine in the middle of the blast to generate the energy they need to travel back in time. That's why there's all that like nuclear stuff in that movie. It's not just random. That's how that movie was supposed to end. So Spielberg clearly was just holding on to this darling and really just wanted to use it, so they did. And again, I don't really have a problem with any of that. It's pretty funny. There's a lot of like little comedic moments, like how they're playing Howdy Doody on the TV in the house, and just how Harrison's playing it. And by the way, throughout, Harrison Ford is really bringing his A game. Like, he's clearly engaged throughout. He's funny when he needs to be. He's confused when he needs to be. He's still like packing a lot of action in him. He's actually in really great shape, which I don't think people fully appreciated back then. They just kind of called him old. And I think the script kind of does him a disservice, too, of kind of, like, constantly saying he's doddering and, like, he doesn't have it anymore and this, that, and the other thing. And they're just, like, playing that button a little too much when he clearly still does have it and could have probably been even more action-packed, done more stunts, and, like, been involved even more in the action. But anyway, he clearly is having fun in this scene, and he carries it very well. And it leads to like probably the best image in the entire movie, which is him crawling out of the fridge and then standing up with his hat, and you see the hat against the backdrop of the nuclear, the mushroom cloud coming up from the blast. And that was actually in the script. It says something like Indiana Jones and the Nuclear Age in the Darabont script. So clearly that was like one of the key moments for everyone involved. Then it cuts to this really protracted scene of him being, like, interrogated. It's all this Red Scare stuff. And it's also just to show that, like, even this great war hero with all this, like, decoration and acclaim, and he's saved the world so many times, and still the government's even grilling him and calling him, like, a traitor and a spy, and basically accusing him of all this stuff. Another problem I do have with this movie, though, is that I feel like the way they write Indy, he comes off a lot dumber than he used to be. Like, one of the appeals of the previous movies that I feel like doesn't get highlighted enough is that Indy is a very, like, intelligent and capable person, to the point where like you have him be sort of more immature in Temple of Doom, and then slowly get smarter, or sort of get like more mature and intelligent in the other movies, where he's like analyzing archaeological digs and like dissecting things and just like putting things together. He's clearly supposed to be a clever and cultured individual, and also kind of like a colonialist figure, and that's another problem I have with it, but that's a different issue. So anyway, in this one they have him like mispronouncing nuclear as nuclear. I don't know how it is, but you just like saying it wrong, and he just doesn't seem to be using his intelligence quite as much. So anyway, we cut to this to he's teaching again. There's some nice references to Marcus Brody and Sean Connery, who one had died, and Sean Connery had retired from acting, so he just wasn't going to be in this movie again. I know they really wanted him to come back for the sequel, so it's kind of a shame because maybe he would have elevated it a bit. Maybe we could have all been spared Mutt, who's going to appear very shortly. So anyway, it's like some more exposition. There's a new character who's basically Marcus. It's Jim Broadbent. Doesn't really have much of a purpose in the movie. Maybe they could have had him tag along like Marcus did in the previous adventures, but instead he's just kind of there for a second and gone. So none of that really matters. And basically, Indy's being told to take a forced vacation. There's none of the stuff about him flirting with the students or whatever, which was always kind of weird anyway, so I don't miss that, but it was another aspect to his character for sure. So he's taking a train away when all of a sudden, who should pull up but Shia LaBeouf, wearing a 1950s greaser Marlon Brando outfit, which doesn't fit him at all, and kind of this whole character doesn't fit him at all. It just seems... this is like what I complained about in my Titanic review, is that he just seems like he has... he doesn't have that worldly aspect that his character's kind of asking for. And I don't know what was going on at the time, but for some reason Spielberg really had it in for this guy. Like, he really wanted to cast him in everything. Like, he wrote him Eagle Eye. He cast him for the Transformers trilogy. It must have been something else, but or casting him in Indiana Jones is a big deal for sure. So for whatever reason, Spielberg thought he was the next big thing. Maybe he just really liked Even Stevens. I don't know. Spielberg's an eclectic guy, but obviously in the present we don't really like Shia for myriad reasons. He just kind of seems like maybe a disturbed individual. I don't know. And there's many allegations against him. But putting all that aside, he's a decent actor in this one. He just doesn't have like the action chops, and he's clearly not like a badass like how Indy actually is, like effortlessly. So maybe they could have found like some other sort of self-made person. Harrison used to be a carpenter on movie sets and stuff like that. Like he wasn't an actor at first. But anyway, his presence is it's all right, but what they have him do by the end of the movie kind of ruins the character entirely. But anyway, it comes out that he's kind of an apprentice of Oxley, who we've heard about in these previous movies, who's actually really good in this movie because he's played by John Hurt, who's a great actor. The character's not that great, but he does a good performance as him. So anyway, he goes off with Mutt to a diner, and also the name's pretty dumb. I guess they're just going with that dog motif again for some reason. The diner scene's actually really good. There's a lot of good like little bits of like Mutt stealing beers and then Indy putting it back, or like they had to pick a fight. So there's a nice like classic brawl in the middle of the thing, very reminiscent of Back to the Future again. So a lot of those like boomer 1950s references throughout this movie, like that Zemeckis touch almost. And this actually leads to probably the best sequence in the movie, which was a like car slash motorcycle chase, and it seemed like a lot of this was actually practically shot, with stunt people obviously subbing in when needed. But it seems like they really did shut down a bunch of roads and like have people actually be leaping from cars and like getting pulled into other cars and riding on motorcycles and all that stuff. And that's great. That's exactly what you want. I don't know why they have that in mind in some scenes, but in other scenes they completely forget it. But anyway, it's like an exciting scene. There's lots of, again, nice 1950s backgrounds. I think there's a protest. I don't know what for what, but maybe like a war protest or like a nuclear arms protest. I have no idea. But anyway, this whole sequence ends with they drive through a library, and there's this nice stunt of them like they get off the motorcycle and they're kind of sliding across the floor. And Indy ends up, of course, with a student, and the student's like asking him questions, and he's like off the cuff, kind of answering him. And that's the smart Indy I like to see. Again, I don't know why we lose sight of him so often. So they travel from there, and they track down that Oxley was an insane asylum, and they find all these like ravings, which points them to this other location. Which is like this South American crypt. And I actually really like this sequence for one reason, which is it's very nicely referential to the original movie, to Raiders of the Lost Ark, which of course also has him going and raiding a South American tomb. And there are also some like really creepy stunt people who are like kind of embedded in the walls. It does raise questions about like how long have they been there? Do they switch guard shifts? Stuff like that, logical stuff. But it looks good and it's played well. And him just like going in with Mutt and retrieving whatever the item is they need, I guess like a codex or something to lead them to the next location. It's all well done. I don't really have a problem with Mutt or Indy throughout the sequence. There's of course the scene where Mutt's like, you're a professor, and Indy's like, part-time, and as has been highlighted by Red Letter Media and others, in the trailer they had for the movie, he like delivers it really emphatically and like powerfully, like it's probably supposed to be to make the joke work. But for some reason in the movie they choose a much weaker take where he's just like part-time instead of like part-time. I don't know. It's a very strange choice that they made. So this kind of like initiates the kind of the rest of the film. What it's going to be. So the Russians kidnap Indy again, and they're basically going to take him to where they need to go to, figure out what's going on with this crystal skull stuff. I want to say this movie is, it's not 2 hours. It's not like 3 hours. I think it's, probably 90 minutes to 2 hours right on the dot. I'm not quite sure. But it doesn't, like, outstay its welcome, except that the third act is really bad. And again, I'm not really sure what went wrong there. It also makes me think, like, there's a lot of stuff that happens in animatics and, in the background that maybe for whatever reason, when they were just like ideating and like coming up ideas, they were again like really into all this, CGI antics. Like, what can we do a little bit differently to make this differentiate from the previous films? It's 2 hours exactly. And again, I can respect that on the one hand. Lucas is, or maybe Spielberg more than Lucas, but clearly they're kind of bored and want to keep growing and, try to change what they're doing. So then they're trying to find the mystical city of Akator, which is basically, like El Dorado or whatever. Um, and that's when they get reunited with Oxley, and then eventually they realize that Marion Ravenwood is also there. Again, Mac keeps coming up again and again. That's the Ray Winstone character. Again, his character doesn't really make sense. He's kind of a remnant from a previous draft. I think they could have either changed the character a lot or had a different actor or, I don't know, somehow fixed it. But this is basically... there's like a really big scene where they're just like at the tents, like kind of discovering things. Discovering what the clues mean. Oxley keeps raving madly, but he is indicating what they need to do and where they need to go next, if you pay attention to what he's saying. So this is where they eventually escape from the Russians, and it's kind of more antics because they run off into the woods, and immediately Indy and Marion end up... and by the way, it's great to see Karen Allen again playing Marion. She's a great addition to this film. She doesn't really get a lot to do, and again, she also seems to have lost some IQ points in between the first movie and this one. Again, not really sure what that's about because, the reason people loved her initially because she was such a capable and strong and intelligent woman. So in this one, she just kind of seems like befuddled by everything. It's just very strange the way they change her character. But anyway, her and Indy end up in quicksand, and then Mutt has to use a snake to try to get them out. They go tell Oxley to go find help, and he immediately, of course, brings the Russians over to him. And I think they also have another sort of torture sequence, sort of, it's Irene Spetko, I don't know. The Kate Blanchett's character is, again, trying to do the psychic thing with the crystal skull and with Indy to limited success. And there's also, like, some great indications that Indy has had a lot of adventures in between this one and the previous one. He's helped fight, the remnants of the Nazis and helped be a spy for the Americans, and just kept being a patriotic hero and all that stuff. So it's not like he's just been sitting on his laurels or whatever. So eventually we find out that, the Crystal Skull and Oxley are all part of this, like, previous dig and discovery thing, and they need to, like, find it again. So they figure out a route to the city using automatic writing that Oxley is doing on a map. So it tells them the location, which is along this, like, river. And eventually, the heroes escape again, and Mac keeps switching sides, so they have Mac with them again, claiming to be a double agent. And maybe this is supposed to be funny, I don't know. This is, like, again, Lucas's, like, nadir, I guess. So a lot of this just doesn't work when maybe it previously would have. Lucas was heavily involved in all three of the previous movies, including Crusades and Raiders of the Lost Ark. So clearly he was very helpful and, did know what he was doing at a certain point. I don't really know what happened in his personal life, or, I don't know. At some point he, like, clearly kind of lost some of that taste control or whatever it is, and that maybe just had to do with money and just, like, being successful and acclaimed and all that stuff. So this is the third act where I think the movie really starts to fall apart seriously, and this part I can't really defend. Again, even if they had used a set that looked like a forest, like maybe they could have somehow found a air hanger or something like that, just, like, dressed like a mile of real location as a forest, that still would have looked like way better than this, like, crappy CGI forest that they had them driving through for a really long time. I do just like the callback that Indy, pulls out a rocket launcher to try to shoot the Russian trucks, which is a nice callback to the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he is, threatening to use a rocket launcher but doesn't actually get to do it. So that's just nice from just, like, a lore perspective, or, like, Easter eggs and all that. But this is just a lot of antics of, like, trucks trying to shoot other trucks, and eventually Mutt and Irina get into a sword fight for some reason, because Mutt mentions that he was fencing. Shea does get hit with some plants between his legs a couple of times, which is kind of satisfying, but also really dumb and shouldn't have been in the movie. And I would say you could also, like, if you were doing a fan edit of this movie, to make it a lot better, you could edit out most of this, because nothing of consequence really happens. It's just a lot of people, like, losing track of the crystal skull or losing Mud or Indy or Marion, just like going back and forth between different trucks. So it's just a lot of nonsense and antics that looks bad and isn't fun and isn't action packed. Right? It's nothing. Like in the last movie, we had the whole tank sequence, or there's various sequences throughout all the other movies, or the minecart scene in Temple of Doom. Things that are actually exciting and actually gripping and show the different characters in peril. And you're not just like, well, they're clearly in front of a blue screen with a bunch of pixels dancing around. This is where Mutt gets separated and has to, for some reason, Tarzan swing from vine to vine against some really crappy CGI with a bunch of monkeys following him and sort of teaching him how to do it. I don't think anyone can defend that other than from like the camp perspective. Again, maybe people just haven't seen these 1950s movies that they're referencing, or like even the 30s serials. Maybe that would have been like commonplace to have a character just like start swinging around on some vines, but it looks bad here. There's nothing to it. It's not funny. It's not fun. You want Shia to just go away at this point, but instead he continues being in the movie. And basically it ends up that all the heroes again end up in this like boat car, and the Russians are kind of eluded. There's this other very dumb scene that happens very quickly after, which is, it's actually two dumb things. So first, Marion drives them off a cliff, which somehow they land perfectly on a tree to not kill them all, and then they land into the river. So whatever, that's fine. And then the branch like swings back and kills a bunch of Russians that are climbing down the waterfall or whatever. So it's like Fast and Furious level of unreality, but that's not really appropriate for this series or that series, frankly. But so anyway, then they land in the water, and Oxy's like, we have 3 waterfalls, or like he says, when the 3 waters fall, something like that. He says some psychotic babbling. And it's clearly supposed to be a reference to Temple of Doom, but like leveled up. But it's just really dumb. Basically, they fall over 3 increasingly dangerous waterfalls. And maybe you could see how they could survive that first one. It doesn't seem that deep or that bad. But then by the end, they're falling into this giant, like, swirling, basically looks like Niagara Falls or something like that. And it's just like, okay, there's no way that they could survive that. Definitely not all of them. Definitely not the car would still be fine too, or whatever. It's just ridiculous. Somehow they all land and they're not instantly crushed by rocks or pulled under by the water, or dashed on the water, which is probably like solid at that speed and height. So we're just supposed to turn our brains off and be like, okay, they're probably fine. So anyway, again, if you're doing a fan edit, I would just like maybe do the first waterfall, if that, and just have them like end up on the bottom, and that's it. No 3 waterfalls dumbness. They had to like suspend your willing suspension of disbelief. It gets stretched way too far. Incredulity and all that. This next sequence is fine too. Basically, they make it to Akator, which is like El Dorado, and it's a bunch of indigenous people, and they're going to attack them. But then, I also forgot. At some point, there's like a whole ant sequence, which is fine. It's just trying to be gruesome. The ants look really fake, and they kill the heavy. But it looks really stupid and bad. But the idea is sound, it's perfectly fine. But you think the heavy would last until the end. So anyway, they end up in the city, and they're using the crystal skull to like kind of protect themselves, push through the city. And they eventually end up, inside this temple, which is where everyone wants to go. This is one note that I thought was really sour, which is like the Russians discover the city too, and then the next time we cut to them, like all the indigenous people are dead. So clearly they just like killed them all for some reason. Absolutely no reason to do that. They could have just like held them at gunpoint or like not killed them. It's just like that very tasteless sort of look how evil they are sort of thing, but you don't really need it at this point, so you're just like killing off a bunch of random people for no reason. So anyway, then they descend deeper into the cavern, and this is basically like the end. Irina Speka makes it down there too, and they reunite the skull with, they find this burial chamber with a bunch of different bodies and skulls. It's clearly aliens. Lucas has said in interviews, and the movie says it too, Oxley says, they're actually interdimensional beings. I don't really know what difference it makes if they're interdimensional beings or aliens, but that's just kind of an interesting wrinkle, but doesn't really add anything. to the movie overall. So anyway, the aliens do this weird melding thing where they become one thing, and it's like a flesh-covered alien. And Kate Blanchett is like, "I want to know everything," and then like the thing gives her all this energy, and she like kind of bursts into like energy flames or whatever it is, and then everything gets sucked into a big vortex, and none of it makes any sense. Again, I didn't really have any problem with this in principle. Like, I don't know why people care so much if aliens are in Indiana Jones, like considering everything else that's in these movies. That never, for some reason, that never sat with me as like a valid criticism of this movie. Like, they could have been aliens, but done in a better way. Like, the ending is kind of like very inert and doesn't really mean anything to anyone. So they could have found an interesting way of, you kind of have that like religious awe in Raiders of the Lost Ark and Last Crusade. That spectacle that I don't quite understand. Maybe they're even going for like a Lovecraftian thing. Add some of that back into the script. Like, it doesn't need to be so like cut and dry, like really obvious. But basically, they escape the city. Mac, Ray Winstone's character, gets killed in a very ceremonious way. He's trying to get all this treasure, but he gets sucked into the vortex. Who even knows if he's dead? Maybe he's just on the other side of whatever that portal is, or in some other dimension. I don't know. Maybe he'll come back, the return or the revenge of Mac. But it's all very stupid. So yeah, that's basically the end of the movie. We get another nice scene of the heroes overlooking the waterfalls as like this giant spaceship emerges, and clearly that was like another of the big tentpole scenes they wanted to show. The ship doesn't look very good, the effects aren't convincing, and then disappears very unceremoniously again. It's whatever. I don't know. Again, I would maybe change that, or it could be interesting to just have it be from the character's point of view, like we don't even see what they see. You'd save a ton of money and add some of that awe back in. But for whatever reason, they do show it, and it's very, like, I think that's maybe some of the problem, too, is, like, there's nothing left to the imagination. It's all just, like, right there. So that's basically the end of the movie. Then Indy and Marianne are getting married in this wedding chapel, or, like, a church, I guess. Everyone who's alive is there. Jim Broadbent and Oxley is cleaned up nicely. John Hurt. And at some point also we learned that Mutt is Indy's biological son, which is another very silly reveal. He could have just not been his biological son. Like, what does it matter? Does the math even add up? Someone would have to go back and track like how long it's been between Raiders and this one, in movie time. But I guess it's supposed to be like 17 or 18 years. I don't know. And there's kind of the implication that Mutt might pick up the adventuring after this point. They could have continued the franchise and even recast Mutt, like pick it up many years later and it's just some other actor. I don't know. Fortunately, they didn't. People are always worried that they'd make a sequel with Chris Pratt or something like that, or a reboot. That also has never happened. I'm hoping Indy 5 is good. I haven't seen it yet. So basically, I think there is a lot of good to this movie. I'd say it's even like, maybe not 80%, but maybe 70% a perfectly good movie. But it's just that final 30% is like pretty dumb and pretty bad looking. And if they just done it with like models or physical sets or like real backdrops or, I don't know, any number of ways that like you just wonder like if Spielberg and Lucas can't get this kind of money or like, shoot on location or any of these things, or even shoot real plates. Like, go back to the Phantom Menace, the pod racing scene. The reason that is so good is because it was shot like in real deserts, like against real backdrops. So why couldn't they do the same exact thing for this one and have it look a lot better? They could have even done it the same way. Like, I'm pretty sure the way they shot that is they had a camera shooting slow motion through a canyon in this case. And then they sped it up in post-production, and it looks really good. So that's probably what they should have done for this movie. Again, it was the early 2000s. People really weren't utilizing CGI very well. They're just kind of saying, like, throw everything into CGI. And that's how we end up with movies like The Mummy Returns, which is a lot worse movie than this one, certainly. And it just ends up seeming kind of tasteless. The parts that are physical, that are actually end up being pretty good, like that whole temple sequence I mentioned earlier. The actors are perfectly fine. Harrison, again, is bringing it. There's a lot of bad dialogue, some good dialogue, some good humor, a lot of bad humor as well. So yeah, this movie is a lot of conflicting things, a lot of contrasts. You can clearly see why people consider it to be the worst one. I would also say that like Temple of Doom isn't very good in my opinion. You know, there's a lot of classic bits in that, but overall, I don't think the movie is very good. Um, again, I would just say like if people are saying that this movie is as bad as the prequels, I don't think that's exactly fair to what was going on here. You know, it's still Spielberg directing. It's still a lot of really talented screenwriters. Maybe they should have gone with the Darabont draft or stayed a few drafts earlier. But for whatever reason, they felt the need to keep meddling with it. I think David Koepp as well was credited on this one. You know, it's shot pretty well. I think still on film, but it might have been digital. I'm not sure exactly. Uh, I think it was actually a very successful movie, so it certainly made money. And I think that South Park episode about it is probably what also really made people's perception of it like so negative. And then of course Shia is super annoying and bad in the Transformers movies and basically everything else he's in, and maybe he's just a very bad person in real life as well. Um, Ray Winstone's character could have been actually really great. They just did it very badly in this. I would have loved to see a movie where it's just like another archaeologist, but he's not like evil. He's just like a rival. So basically like an antagonist, but not like a straight up villain. I don't know why they never did that in any of these movies. Like they kind of had the evil rival, but never like the kind of like neutral one. So that would have been interesting. Yeah, I think overall this was Harrison still in top form. I haven't seen the fifth one yet. I know there's a lot of CGI going on with face replacements and stuff like that. Who knows if that works? Um, the stuff that works, I think, in this movie works really well. I think there is a fan edit somewhere in here that improves it a lot, that brings it from like a 65 or whatever to like an 80. Maybe I'll work on one. I don't know. I have to figure that out. But yeah, I think people really focus on the negative aspects of this film and kind of miss the forest for the trees, as they do in this tree sequence, in this forest sequence in this movie. Um, and yeah, I think with a few modifications, you know, less reliance on CGI and more physical sets and like that, I think this movie could have been a real winner. And even then, I still think like I had a perfectly good time when I came out of the cinemas when I came out originally. And even rewatching it, I'm like, it's mostly good, it's mostly there, but like obviously the bad parts are really bad and kind of drag it down ultimately. You know, I definitely think it's worth a rewatch or an original watch. And maybe even more stuff from behind the scenes will come out that'll reveal like what happened, you know, to make it so bad. Again, I don't think there's any rescuing Shia, obviously, and I think the third act is kind of a mess, and Mac's a big mess. But yeah, check it out, and for more content, make sure to follow and subscribe. And thank you for watching.